afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming here to this special seminar. It's lovely to see some new faces in the room. I'm here to welcome my colleague and friend, Morgan Carpenter. Morgan is a bioethicist and also an activist, an activist in the intersex human rights space. And I think one of the exciting things about Morgan and about the way that he thinks and speaks is that he can open up new areas. I think one of the most exciting things in a seminar context like this is when you hear somebody speak who starts to help you see the world differently and in a more complex and nuanced way. And I think that that is one of the things that we can promise here at this seminar, that Morgan is going to start you thinking more broadly and deeply than you have about some of these issues before, and sort of open your minds about some of these very, very important issues here. So I'd like you to give him a very warm welcome. We're very, very lucky to have you here today, Morgan.
Thank you, Bridget, for that very kind and generous welcome, and also for the invitation to come here and speak today. Can you all hear me okay in the room? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here and a real honor to be here speaking at the Kirby Institute. And I'm going to talk about intersex human rights issues. I'm going to talk about intersex from both a human rights perspective, a legal perspective, and also a medical perspective. And if you're not familiar with any of those areas, you might find some of what I'm going to talk about quite troubling. So please be conscious of how you're feeling, and if you need to take a break, then please do that. But also before I begin, I want to acknowledge that we're gathered on the land of the Bedigal people of the Eora Nation. And I live and work on Gadigal land in the Eora Nation. And the land on which we live and work has not been ceded. And there's as yet no treaty. I also want to acknowledge that Indigenous stories and histories about being born with intersex variations in Australia have not yet been told. So what I'm going to talk about is going to very much come from a colonial perspective in the sense of looking at Western legal system and how that has been implemented in Australia, and looking at the Western medical system and what that means for how people's bodies are treated. So before I came in, as I tend to do, one thing I did was take a look at the UNSW website and have a look at where intersex is mentioned and talked about, and the kinds of ways in which intersex is talked about, within the setting that we're in today at the university, in the college setting. And there are a number of different kinds of ways of describing where intersex people fit into the life of the university and into particular types of activities at university. And one of them, well, what I've done actually is pick out a few different distinct strands of thinking about who intersex people are and where we fit in and what our needs and issues are. And one of the first ones to come up on, if you do a web search on this on the university website, is the Ally Network, which talks about people who identify as LGBTIQ, and intersex is the I in that acronym. So we see a framing here about intersex people as an identity. The Ally Network also, until very recently, until talking about coming in today, framed intersex issues within an even more narrower framework about gender identity and gender affirmation and transition support within the Ally Network. So there's a page here that talked about intersex and transgender student support as being issues about planning your transition. There's also some cultural explorations about what it means to be intersex on the UNSW website. And this is a review of a performance earlier this year, which talks about a fictional love child of Leon Trotsky and Frida Kahlo, whose costume highlights her sexuality with a sparkling gem adorning her crotch, lighting that is lit with blue and pink. And the character, Carmen, is described as other. And the performance included what was described here as a practical and scientific definition of what it means to be intersex, as well as what's described as a moving account of what it feels like to be an intersex person. And if we look at the photo that accompanies the story, then we can see very much a kind of a gender performance going on here, with flowers and a corset and a moustache. Then if we look at what's happening in the medical faculty or the medical school, there's a statement there about the ally network in medicine here at UNSW, talking about how intersex students and others should be able to enjoy their time here without feelings of alienation or ill treatment. And we can also see the use of the word intersex itself in some of the curriculum. This is from embryology in medicine. So the title is How and Why Do Things Go Wrong in Development? And descriptions about human genital abnormalities, disorders of sex development, tract abnormalities, and a discussion also about the replacement of what is described here as outdated and stigmatizing language, including true hermaphrodites, male pseudohermaphrodites, and female pseudohermaphrodites. So this is quite a diverse, different range of ways of understanding who intersex people are. And it's quite difficult to work out how these relate directly to the same population in some ways, because we've seen something about gender performance, we've seen material about identity, we also see information here about, you know, physical development, and it's described as being abnormal physical development. So what I'm going to do is try and navigate. Oh, sorry, there's also this framing here, which I almost forgot to focus on. This is a different framing from a law journal at UNSW that talks about complicity between medical and legal constructions of variations of sex development as pathological disorders in urgent need of correction. So how do we navigate all these very different ways of understanding who intersex people are? And I'm proposing that there is a way of understanding these issues, and in some ways a way of understanding these issues as forms of discourse that are in conflict with each other. So on the one hand, we see that intersex bodies are normalized by medicine, are constructed as abnormal, while the law others intersex identities. We see a Cartesian duality here, really. So medicine describes intersex people as either female or male with disorders of sex development, while the law increasingly regards the same people as neither female nor male and members of a third sex category. So these different ideas actually relate to the same population using very different language. And both approaches are prescriptive. They describe who intersex people should be and what our issues are, without people having any kind of personal agency in that process themselves. So this is the basic medical model. The medical model says that disorders of sex development are congenital conditions in which development of chromosomal, gonadal, or anatomical sex is atypical. And this comes from a statement in 2006. If we look at the alternative, the legal model, this is a statement in Time magazine last year, and I've chosen it because it kind of encapsulates the issues very clearly. This is a judge in the Californian court system who's saying that many individuals are born with such chromosome, endocrine, or hormonal irregularities, and their birth certificates are inaccurate because in the US, birth records are not designed to allow doctors to designate an ambiguous sex. Now, neither of those two models uses the word intersex, but both of them refer to the same population. Yeah, we've got chromosomal, gonadal, or anatomical sex in both cases. And those models, those two approaches, I'm going to talk about in much detail. But when I do that, I'm simplifying the issue to some extent. Both of those models are simplifications. So medicine describes intersex people as disordered females or males, but intersex women may not be female enough to compete in sport unless they submit to medicalization. The law describes intersex people as neither female nor male, but the welfare jurisdiction of the family court is complicit with medicine when approving special medical procedures. So this is what I'm going to talk about. Now, when I've given this talk before, there are what I might call some order effects in how I describe the population and the issues that I'm going to talk about. And the best way I've come up with trying to explain some basic information about the population that demonstrates, that helps you to understand why these models don't respect or reflect our diversity, is to give you a kind of a bit of a grounding at the beginning about who the population are, using slightly more neutral language. So the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and a range of different human rights institutions talk about intersex people as being born with physical or biological sex characteristics that don't fit typical definitions for male or female bodies. And that, if you like, is kind of a generic, neutral definition of who intersex people are. And this definition also points out very importantly that intersex people, for some intersex people, these traits are apparent at birth, while for others they emerge later in life, like at puberty. They may also be diagnosed prenatally or through the use of IVF. People can discover they have an intersex trait when trying to conceive a child. There are a range of other times people may discover they have an intersex trait or variation. And this definition makes no statements about how intersex people identify in terms of sex or gender, or how we're assigned at birth, or how we might respond to that later in life. It makes no statements about sexual orientation either. It makes no suggestions that people are going to transition. And if we look at some sociological research on intersex people in Australia in 2015, using a convenience sample and an online survey, then we can see that, oh, you can't see the numbers there. It's unhelpful. So in this chart, in this study of 272 people born with atypical sex characteristics, 52% of people understand themselves as women, as female. 23% understand themselves as male. 7% chose an X gender marker. 6% said they were unsure what sex or gender marker they might prefer. And 12% of people gave another option. So really we see here quite a lot of diversity in the ways in which people understand their sex and gender. This is not a situation where everybody wants a single classification to suit them. We also see a lot of diversity in terms of sexual orientation in this survey of people aged 16 to 85. And 46% of people in the study understand themselves as heterosexual. 10% understand themselves as asexual. And there are a variety of other LGB, or no, yeah, there's no T there because we're not talking about gender identity. There's a range of different ways of understanding ourselves. There's also a range of different kinds of words that people in this study use to describe their bodies. And the study found that 60% of respondents use the word intersex. And that's people who have intersex variation, people who have an intersex condition, people who say, I am intersex, but also people who refer to their diagnosis. They might refer to their chromosomes. They might use medicalized language of difference of sex development or disorder of sex development. And you can see there how different people use that language differently depending upon the setting. So in accessing medical services, people are far more likely to use the medical language of disorders of sex development, but otherwise will not. We also saw in that study quite a strong disagreement with ideas prevalent in medicine about genitals fitting size norms and being socially modified, and about people selecting against intersex offspring using IDF, and the use of surgical interventions without clinicians knowing long-term outcomes. So these show very much a very diverse population in a sociological convenience sample. And these show very different forms of understanding to the kinds of understandings that we see in the UNSW papers about intersex. You know, where people talk about intersex as an identity, or talk about intersex as a matter of embryology and abnormality, with the implication that bodies have to be fixed. So we're a very diverse population. And how did we get to this point where people find it really difficult to understand who intersex people are when we have such a diverse population? That diversity is not acknowledged. Well, we can go back to the start of medicalization in the 19th century, or we can even go back before that. And historically, in the kind of the Western legal system that we have, there was an acknowledgement that there are men, there are women, and there were hermaphrodites who would be treated as male or female, depending upon prevailing sex characteristics. And this was the norm, not only in this example, which comes what changed is that intersex bodies became medicalized at the same time that women's bodies became medicalized, at the same time that queer bodies became medicalized. And Elizabeth Rees talks about how in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, hermaphroditism became synonymous, or virtually synonymous, with immorality and perversion. And we can see this thinking in the discussion about Carmen being the other, still today. And Elizabeth Rees says that physicians in the 1880s, 1890s wanted their patients to understand their hermaphroditic conditions as deformities, not a physical license to commit sexual immorality. And here's an example of that from J.W. Long in 1896, when he says, "I believe we owe it to these poor unfortunates to impress upon them, as well as upon others, that they are not part man and part woman. The peculiarities that make them appear mixed are only deformities like hair lip or club foot." And these comparisons are still made today. The language has changed. People talk about cleft palate or club foot rather than hair lip. But these same comparisons are still made by clinicians working today in this area of medicine. By the 1950s, there were sexologists like John Money making recommendations concerning case management, which also still persist today. And John Money and John Hampson said, for neonatal and young infant hermaphrodites, we recommend that sex be assigned primarily, not exclusively, on the basis of appearance of external genitalia and how well they lend themselves to surgical reconstruction or conformity with sex of assignment. The idea at that point was that gender was malleable and that the gender identity of these infants could be reinforced through surgical management and psychosocial support. We now have a better understanding that some aspects of gender identity might be innate. But this medical model is still, I think, very much the norm, and I will show you this. We can see that medical model become implemented in Australia in this article from the Medical Journal of Australia in 1966, where these three doctors talk about a case report of a child who came to them, well, a young adult who came to them, and this discussion here about how he had a gross phallic deformity that he was told could not be corrected until he was 16. but that the medical practice at the time of this paper had become one where early surgical management had become the norm. We can also see here how both the subject and his parents had understood that he was able to live a normal life at school and commence work. And his so-called deformity had become accepted. It's the clinical framing of his body as deformed that's happening here, because you can see how the subject had not made that assumption. By 1969, alternatives to medicalization had to be imagined. This is from a book by Dewhurst and Gordon in London, talking about how to visualize individuals who properly belong neither to one sex nor the other is to imagine freaks, misfits, and curiosities, condemned to a solitary existence. And the tragedy of their lives that can be remediable. The remedy there, of course, is surgery. But the idea here that you had to imagine somebody who had not undergone medical intervention kind of shows how intersex bodies and people have shifted from reality, from being a normal place in school or the workplace, to actually becoming mythologized here. By 1993, doctors were talking about how still you can make a hole, but you can't build a pole. It's much easier to assign somebody female than it is male. And these technical considerations drive surgery, drive assignment as well. And in the same year, 1993, there were no complaints. This Dr. Milton Edgerton talks about how no one has complained of loss of sensation, even when the entire clitoris had been removed. Now, I don't know how many of you were born in 1993, but people who have been through this kind of medical intervention under this model are still in their 20s, and they might still be coming through university right now. And there's an argument to say how much has changed. I will come on and show you a couple of current examples. So in 1993, no one has ever complained. That's also the year that the first advocacy organization was established, the Intersex Society of North America. And just 3 years later, the people in that organization were being described as the unhappy ones, the disgruntled ones, and zealots in the New York Times. So we've gone from just a 3-year period where there's been no complaints to one where those that do complain are disgruntled, are zealots, are the unhappy ones, are a minority. This actually is an attempt to discredit, and this actually still happens today as well. It's still evident in clinical writings about intersex people and intersex advocacy. Nevertheless, the intersex movement was established, and this was a photograph taken at the first ever demonstration by intersex people in October 1996, and that was so significant it's now marked as Intersex Awareness Day. They managed to frame intersex issues as matters of social policy and ethics, rather than issues around abnormality and being fixed. But there was a very strong clinical response to that. And really from about 2006, we see a reassertment of clinical authority and a shift to this new language of disorders of sex development, no longer using the word intersex, trying to shift the discourse back toward a very medicalized framework. Because if you have a disorder, then it surely has to be fixed. The consensus statement that did this, you might hope it's grounded in evidence, but there's very little evidence in support of clinical practices that seek to fix intersex bodies. So if we look, the rationales for early reconstruction include parental distress and stigmatization. We see here also mitigating the risks of gender identity confusion, which has a direct link back to the words of John Money in the 1950s. And these rationales themselves are based on feelings and beliefs. So we see here a statement that is generally felt that surgery that's carried out for cosmetic reasons in the first year of life relieves parental distress and improves attachment. The evidence for this belief is lacking. And you can see this, the same language about feelings, beliefs, and even opinion in submissions made to 2013 Senate inquiry by clinical organizations and hospitals. And indeed, in 2013, there was a Senate inquiry on involuntary or coerced sterilization of intersex people. And the clinical submission describes what I've just shown you and other documents as consensus statements that describe recommended indications for genital and gonadal surgery. And they recommend surgery for the purpose of appearance, including reduction of an enlarged clitoris or construction of a urinary outlet to the end of a penis, for what they describe as functional reasons to allow a male individual to urinate while standing, which to me is a cultural rationale. And for psychosocial rationales, such as allowing a child to develop without stigma or distress. Again, this goes back to these feelings and beliefs that go back to John Moore. And they themselves say there is limited evidence regarding long-term outcomes, with particular concern regarding sexual function and sensation. 3 years later, there was a follow-up to 2006 consensus statement, which showed there is still no evidence. And in fact, there's no clinical consensus about medical practices at all, including indications, timing, procedure, or evaluation of outcome of surgery. There's no evidence regarding the impact of surgically treated or non-treated intersex variations for individuals, parents, society, or the risk of stigmatization. But yet we also see claims that this claim is made the same year that that we can save intersex people from becoming the other through surgery. So this is by a paper called Michael Connor at Western Sydney University, who says that preserving the human rights of the child to self-determination may threaten their right to be free from discrimination. No human rights institution would accept that model. We also see in Australia claims that medical practices have changed, that things are not as bad as they were a decade ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Often these are based upon ideas that technical outcomes from surgery have improved, which to my mind doesn't tackle the much deeper, broader issue about, you know, whether surgery was needed in the first place, whether it was justified in the first place. But this is an example from Queensland, where the Queensland government said that, you know, previously it wasn't accepted practice to assign external genitalia during childhood, and how research and investigation now advise against irreversible or long-term procedures unless the condition poses a serious risk to health. Now, I've chosen this quote, even though I have quotes from other jurisdictions in Australia, because I want to show you a case study, a couple of case studies. And those two case studies are both in Queensland. And they're very helpful because they are family court case studies. They show us the family court's thinking about what should happen in terms of how it should approve special medical procedures and for what reason. So this first case study is of a child with 17-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase 3. And the consensus statement in 2006 says that there is a intermediate risk of germ cell malignancy, a 28% risk. It recommends monitoring gonads. And that data is based on 2 studies based upon 7 patients. That's quite normal for clinical studies of intersex variations. They're based on very small numbers of individuals. Between the 2006 consensus statement and now, there has been a reduction in the risk level that we understand. There have also been statements that the cancer risk, even for high-risk groups, is not so high, and we can monitor with ultrasound and for tumor markers. So some clinicians, leading clinicians elsewhere in the world, are making those claims. If we look at the consensus statement from 2016, the 10-year update, this talks about how male assignment is recommended, since more than 50% of individuals will switch from female to male assignment at puberty or later. It also talks about how gonadectomies are recommended or associated with unclear gender or female assignment in what they describe as under-virilization, which kind of captures where 17-beta-HSD fits into the kind of framework about how intersex variations are organized clinically right now. The World Health Organization's ICD-11 Foundation talks about this variation in this way. It says that if diagnosis is made at birth, gender assignment must be discussed depending on the expected results of masculinizing genitoplasty. If female assignment is selected, feminizing genitoplasty and gonadectomy must be performed. And it also talks about eliminating the possibility of having a child with this variation through the use of IVF or other technologies. So prenatal diagnosis is available if kindred have somebody with this variation in their family. So what we see here is not a framework around cancer risk, but a framework around gender assignment and what has to happen based upon that gender assignment. We can also see how that gender assignment is based upon technical matters, about the expected outcomes of masculinizing genitoplasty. So in 2016, the Family Court of Australia adjudicated a case of a child with this variation, who they call Carla, a pseudonym. And Carla was born in 2010, was 5 years old, and about to start school at the time the case was taken. The judge said she was born with a sexual development disorder, which I think shows a relationship between having sex variation and being queer or trans, this idea of having disordered sexual development. The judge said, surgery already performed on Carla has enhanced the appearance of her female genitalia. And he also said that was a clitoral recession and labiaplasty when she was aged around 3. So if we think, this is in Queensland in 2016, where just a couple of years beforehand, the government had said that research and investigation now advises against any irreversible long-term procedure being performed unless there is a serious risk to their health. But what's the serious risk here? I mean, this is very clearly a cosmetic intervention that's about enhancing genital appearance. What's striking as well is that surgery was not one that went before the court. What went before the court was a proposal to sterilize the child. And the judge said that can be authorized by either of the parents. The judge referred to case reports from one of the doctors that used obsolete data on cancer risk to justify the sterilization, and talked about sterilization being one of, if not the major reasons for undertaking the procedure, with limited alternatives to that procedure. But if we delve down into some of the rationales that are described in the family court judgment, we can see a lot more about the reasons for the case. So here, her parents were able to describe a clear, consistent development of a female gender identity in this 5-year-old child who's undergone surgery to enhance the appearance of a female genitalia. We can see how her parents have supplied photographs and other evidence of how the child has a range of stereotypical play interests, a Barbie bedspread, camper van, fairy stations, lip gloss. We can also see more. It goes on to talk about a floral skirt, glittery sandals, Minnie Mouse underwear, and long blonde hair in braids. And this child who's had enhancements to her female genitalia has never tried to stand while urinating. This child has no agency over any of these characteristics. She's 5. She's not yet begun school. The judge said it would be less psychologically traumatic for Carla if the sterilization is performed before she's able to understand the nature of the procedure. So it's preempting her own ability to consent later on as an adolescent or adult. And the judge also said that Carla may also require other surgery in the future to enable her vaginal cavity to have adequate capacity for sexual intercourse. So what kind of sexual intercourse is being described here? It's heterosexual intercourse. And of course, that surgery was not carried out. Now, if she can wait to undergo this, why was she not able to wait to undergo the sterilization? Why was she not able to wait before undergoing the surgical enhancements to her female genitalia? Well, really, this is surgery based upon gender stereotypes and making people fit what is perceived to be a social norm about how girls are supposed to look. Now, there's another case in 2017 called Caitlin, that's also in Queensland, where this child has grown up with a pituitary issue, which means that her body is incapable of naturally producing testosterone or many other hormones. She identified as female from a very early age and has always resented being characterized as male. But she had to go on some kind of sex hormone to kickstart puberty, and she was put on testosterone at about age 12 or 13. And she didn't know what that was. And when she knew what that was, she became non-compliant with the treatment. The case was taken to give her access to estrogen. And the judge made no comment about the inappropriateness of the testosterone treatment, but simply said it would be fanciful to suggest that court authorization would be required before she'd be given testosterone. But why was she given it in the first place? So this is the medical model about how people with intersex bodies are treated in Australia right now. What I'm going to go on to is the third sex legal model. And it doesn't date back to this case, but this is a case where somebody with intersex variation, Klinefelter syndrome, sought a third or non-binary sex marker. And Alex McFarlane won that probably 2002, reported in 2003, quite some time ago. That was Alex's choice, but there have been some very interesting consequences that come from that, including an assumption in this example from a magazine, where the expectations of what it means to have a third sex marker have been generalized to the extent that they don't recognize the diversity of intersex people, but they have some very pious hopes about what it might mean for that population as an entirety. So we see here a claim that a third sex category gives parents a right to choose a third option. And creating that third category means that parents and doctors are not forced to put intersex babies through surgeries that would turn them into male or female. This idea of transition is implicit in this. And there's an assumption that intersex people, as they grow up, they will have the right to realize what's actually described here as a homogeneous, singular identity, a third identity, an other identity. So looking at Caitlin and Carla, we can see that none of this is true. The third category might exist. It does exist in Australia, but it doesn't do these things. Yet we see policymakers making the same kinds of judgments when they introduce those third categories. So this is a letter to me from the Chief and Health Minister in ACT in 2014, 5 years ago now, where she said that a third marker will create a new parental right, and it will reduce the risk that parents will force their child to conform to a particular gender or subject them to gender assignment surgery. But this minister was a chief and health minister. So she's responsible for the hospitals where people might undergo gender assignment surgery, what she's describing as gender assignment surgery. And she also wrote to me a couple of months before that to say, well, actually, in the event of a birth of a baby with a disorder of sex development, clinicians follow a standard investigation and management practice consistent with international consensus statements, which, as I've shown you, are based upon feelings and beliefs. And the recommendation is that surgery is performed in Melbourne or Sydney. So in Sydney, that means the Children's Hospital at Randwick, it means the hospital next door to you, or it means at Westmead. In Melbourne, that means at RCH Melbourne or at Monash. And there are other hospitals as well. But what we see here is a situation where we could be talking about two completely different populations. Here we're talking about an intersex population, which can be assigned a third category, and that's going to be all wonderful. But if we use the clinical language as disorder of sex development, then suddenly there is this medicalization. But how, we're seeing here a situation where policymakers don't have a coherent understanding of a population that is referred to in both of these statements. And this is quite difficult. As an advocate, it's very difficult. From a bioethics perspective, it's also quite shocking, really, that we don't see any coherent understanding of the population. But I was talking about the third sex model of intersex, and this idea that intersex people are a third sex. And this idea doesn't just date back in Australia to Alex McFarlane choosing that, and choosing a passport. It dates back at least to 1979, when the family court decided that, that a man with an intersex variation was not a man at all. And therefore his marriage should be annulled, and was annulled, because the wife was mistaken as the identity of her husband. So this is a very concrete example of the way the law has really othered intersex people in Australia. And this actually is ahistorical. If we go back to early common law, if we go back to canon law or Roman law, then hermaphrodites were either male or female, depending upon prevailing sex characteristics. So this was ahistorical. At the time, people didn't know what to do with it. We can see here an example of somebody looking at this case and describing it as a case of somebody who is a true transsexual. But the individual in this case, who she says here is assigned by surgical process to one of the biological sexes, is actually the case I described earlier in a medical journal of Australia in 1966. It's this man whose parents were told he was a male with a gross phallic deformity. And at what point did he become a transsexual? At what point did he become a hermaphrodite in the eyes of the law, and neither male nor female? We can see here how he did actually choose surgery, and he underwent multiple surgeries, including a double mastectomy and surgeries to his gonads. But when did he become a true transsexual? He was assigned male at birth. He was a male at the time of the family court case. Now, that case has been repudiated, and the family court says in this case from last year that it's been authoritatively repudiated. But yet it's still referred to as a case where the husband was found to be a hermaphrodite, neither a male nor a female. So what does that mean for other intersex people in Australia? I mean, this case is not a case about the right to marry. It's about whether somebody's identity is recognized as valid, or really whether their sex assignment at birth is regarded as valid. This idea that intersex people are a third sex or should be a third sex comes up in many other settings as well. And I mentioned sport earlier. Now, in 2018, the IAAF stated that legal categories other than simply male or female now exist because people with intersex variations exist. And we see really an accommodation of that way of understanding intersex people but it's not one that says that people can choose whether they are male, female, or a third category. It's one that says if you refuse the medicalization of your body, then you are in that third category. So we see a third sex essentially as punishment for those who resist medicalization of their bodies. So we have a situation where medicine constructs intersex people as either female or male, while law and society increasingly construct intersex people as neither female nor male. Medicalization is posed and has been posed as a solution to stigma and othering, while legal othering is posed as a solution to medicalization. Neither of these models is based upon sound evidence. Often it's based upon feelings and beliefs. Neither respects the diversity of the population or what we might choose for ourselves. But this conflict comes from different ideas about the meaning of intersex variations and even how to name them, even while there is agreement about the fundamental characteristics of the population. We're talking about the same population, but people have very different expectations about what that means. So there is a human rights response to this that focuses on demands for self-determination, individual self-determination, and on recognizing rights to bodily integrity and ending social prejudice and stigma. There's been a turn to the human rights system. And this is the kind of declaration that we're seeing come out of the human rights system, a statement that states must prohibit medically unnecessary surgery and procedures on intersex children and uphold rights to autonomy, including freedom from violence and harmful practices and freedom from torture and ill treatment. We have here seen a Senate inquiry in 2013. Intersex status was added to a discrimination law. There have been federal sex and gender guidelines that actually have muddied the waters very considerably. We've also seen a community consensus statement taking place in 2017, which I'll show you in a moment. And we've seen statements on practices in Australia by UN treaty bodies that call for the implementation of recognition for the rights to bodily integrity. We also now have commencement of a Human Rights Commission inquiry on protecting the rights of intersex people in the context of medical treatment. But the consensus statement is really important, and I want to kind of end on this. The Darlington Statement is a consensus statement by advocates in both Australia and New Zealand, and it says that attempts to classify intersex people as a third sex or gender do not respect our diversity or right to self-determination and can inflict wide-ranging harm, irrespective of how we identify. It also calls for reform to clinical practices, including, because of the lack of actual action on this issue, prohibition as a criminal act of deferrable medical interventions that alter the sex characteristics of children, along with the development of appropriate human rights-based lifetime standards of care and independent oversight. There's not been much action on these points at all so far in Australia. There has been in Malta, and there have been some moves towards recognizing these issues in Portugal and in some other parts of Europe. Here, I think we're waiting for the Australian Human Rights Commission inquiry report to come out later this year to identify the next steps about how we might do these things in Australia. So thank you very much for listening. I hope it's been enlightening. There's time for questions, so please, if you have any questions, let me know. But thank you for listening.
And for people who are online, they can send their questions through and we'll follow up on those. Does anybody have something burning that they would like to ask Morgan at the moment? Andrew.
Thank you for a really interesting presentation. A lot of the focus of why surgery might be proposed for an intersex person is about the medical system. How do parents come into this? How do the parents of these babies, 3 years old, 5-year-olds, 9-year-olds, how do they come into it, and how do they respond to this emerging dialogue about rights?
How do parents respond to medical
whether they should do surgery on their intersex babies or young child?
Questions on whether okay, I'm repeating a question for people online, but whether parents should, how do they respond to this discussion about whether they should consent to surgery on their children? Well, that's a really good question. Thanks for raising it. I think that parents may not be exposed to the discourse about human rights, and they may think it might refer to a different identity-based population of people who can choose an intersex identity, which is not the case. So I think there is a disjunction between the human rights discourse and the discourse people might use in LGBTI-friendly settings, and the discourse of sexual development disorders that doctors might use in a medical setting. So that distinction limits people's access to information. To my mind, that limits their ability to provide informed consent, even as well. I gave you a quote a little earlier from Mike O'Connor from a paper in 2016. He's a professor at Western Sydney, and he talks about what's called a DSD forum in New South Wales that has in 1 year accepted 13 cases to discuss whether surgery should be early or late, which doesn't address the issue about whether surgery is justified or not. But he talks in that paper about how the views of parents are taken into consideration, which is a very paternalistic framing of who takes responsibility for making a decision in the first place. But there's a lot of research that's been published in the last year or two that shows that parents are perhaps in some cases told about uncertainty, but they're told about uncertainty in a way that essentially directs parents toward a particular kind of outcome, which is surgery. So I don't think parents are being given a diversity of information. They're being given medicalized language, which is often predicated upon medical solutions, which are surgical solutions. We also hear that there is, in many cases, when it comes to masculinizing genitoplasties and feminizing genitoplasties, that there are no well understood non-surgical pathways even. So there is a lot that's lacking, and that's why this consensus statement talks about proposing standards of care as well as a prohibition on forced or coercive treatment.
You mentioned that in, I think, Malta and Portugal, you said that there have been moves towards this human rights-based approach. Do you mean that legislatures in those jurisdictions have prohibited procedures? And is that the sort of framework that you think is necessary, a legal framework first, in order to stop these procedures and enable support systems to be put in place?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. So Malta has enacted legislation, so in 2015. But that legislation does recognize children's right to bodily integrity and physical autonomy. And it does prevent surgeries from happening without demonstrable evidenced need. That prohibition has now been accompanied by a penalty that's equivalent to the penalty for female genital mutilation. But we have very little data on how that's been implemented as yet. But we're in a situation where governments have so far in Australia made these kinds of statements. There have been expectations that, oh, we don't do that anymore. There's been disbelief that things could happen. So getting a prohibition on the table in the first place has been very difficult for us. I think it's also maybe worth saying here that there is often, policymakers have this belief that identity recognition is the way to answer these questions, when it doesn't do that at all. So yeah, I mean, we want, as an advocacy movement, as an intersex human rights movement, we want actual legislative reform.
Anthony.
I wonder if you could speak to, I guess, the dearth of evidence that we have about what's actually still being performed in hospitals, and because I know that there's quite a barrier in even being able to understand what's happening and the extent to which it continues to happen. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Questions about evidence. How much do we know about what's going on in Australia? Well, you know, over time, we've been able to build up a range of different forms of evidence. I mean, one key problem is that as an adult with intersex variation, when I talk about what's happened to my body historically, that's described as being relating to an obsolete medical practice. I mean, it doesn't happen anymore. And that this fits into this idea that surgery technically has improved. Yeah, and the idea that technical improvements in surgery can improve outcomes, which doesn't answer the question about necessity or justification. So there is this ongoing barrier that whenever we talk with clinicians about what's happening now, they say that's not what happened when you had surgery. And this is essentially something that can shift over time. I first heard that I read that going back to clinical papers in 1987, in 1995. So these claims have been made over a 30-year period, and they could be made for another 30-year period. You know, where people can be talking about what's happened to them, and doctors will say, "Oh, that doesn't happen anymore. That happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 30 years ago." So what do we know about what's happening now? The paper by Michael Connor talks about what's happening in this state. We have some data put to the site in 2013 by RCH Melbourne. We also have some information from news reports about what's happening now, very little of it though. And we also have access to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare data, which shows not much change over the period from 2003 to 2014-15. Yeah, there's been no clear reduction in numbers of interventions over a period where there has been contestation about those medical interventions. So if you look at Ricala and the enhancement to her genitals, AIHW data, Department of Health data suggests that maybe around 70 of those happen each year for 70 surgeries to deal with what are called congenital malformations that are surgeries like the one that Carla had. We know that the same number happen on children each year. So that's quite a number each year. There are even more masculinizing surgeries that happen each year. And of course, you know, we also hear from parents and from other people as well, but that's dismissed as anecdotal. Having the family court data, I think, has led directly to the current Human Rights Commission inquiry.
Oh, you can have one last question.
Just a quick question, maybe just awareness of any cases of litigation.
Litigation has been something we thought long and hard about. There has been litigation in Germany that's been successful. There's been litigation in the US that's been unsuccessful. And there's been litigation in Chile as well. But litigation is particularly challenging in the Australian context for a couple of reasons. One of which is the application of statutes of limitations and the fact that you can't go back very far. It's very difficult to go back to surgery that happened to you in childhood if you're 20 or 30. But there are other issues as well. If doctors can say, as they do, that they've benchmarked their practices against other doctors, this is what the consensus statements say, this is what the indications are, then that effectively means that doctors are performing best practice kinds of medical interventions, and you can't, that limits opportunities for litigation.
we will have to finish now. I'd like you to join me in thanking Morgan for a fascinating.
Thank you very much.
We do hope to have Morgan back at UNSW in the next teaching term to speak with the Ally Network. So I'd encourage you to come along if you have more questions and things that you would like to ask them. Thank you.
Yes.
You can see the slide.
Yeah, come on, Bridget. Should we be in front of it though? Or?